Okay, yes.
And we are really excited to get things started. Just for quick housekeeping tips, we prefer that attendees stay on mute and keep their videos off so that we can give our undivided attention to our presenters. I'm going to make sure that everyone stays on mute, but feel free to use the chat if you want to communicate questions or comments. Feel free to use the chat. And if you have most of your questions, we are going to get a chance to field towards the end after Dana's presentation. So if you want to save your questions, that's fine. I'm also going to field them and checking the chat to make sure that all of your questions get answered. But without further ado, Ms. Dana Owens is going to introduce herself and get us started.
Good morning. It is early here. It's 9 a.m., although I see my principal is here. She sets meetings at this time, even though I have just met her. So as you enter, I see some people still coming in. Just share where you're from. I have just kind of an icebreaker. Just want to know, would you rather teach African American history to the current occupant of the White House, or teach Betsy DeVos Introduction to School Leadership, teach your current governor or your city council microbiology, or teach all of your favorite students in person in your home at the same time for the entire semester. So in the chat box, if you could A, B, C your answer. I introduce myself. So I'm going to start with the land acknowledgement. I am from the land of the Kickapoo, the Osage, the Kaw, and the Sioux. I'm learning more about where I am here in the upstate of South Carolina. But my understanding is that this is the land of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indian and the Catawba Indian Nation. I am entering my 7th year as a professional school counselor and will be completing my final 2 components to become nationally board certified for the early childhood through young adulthood developmental levels, and that's ages 3 to 18 plus. I have yet to celebrate 1 year since I relocated to the upstate of South Carolina. I considered the area because of the community's reputation for supporting educators, but I ultimately decided to move here and become a counselor here because of their commitment, the district's commitment to providing comprehensive counseling for students and families. Just before I arrived, they reduced the student to counselor ratio to the recommended 250 to 1, and have plans to do the same at the elementary level. So I'm very excited to be in a district that has a commitment to professional school counseling and knows the value of it. I was the first African and only African American in the inaugural class, graduating class, accredited by the National Arts of School, National Association of Schools of Art and Design at Kansas State University, when I earned my Bachelor of Fine Arts in Graphic Design in 2003 and minored in Women's Studies. I have a Master of Arts in Counseling and Guidance from the University of Missouri in Kansas City from 2014. I studied abroad with North Carolina State University in Honduras. I have worked as an internet marketing analyst at an ad agency whose niche was higher education, delivered intensive behavior treatment as a research assistant for a sports-based camp for students with ADHD, worked as a graduate student in student affairs, and also worked as a school-based high school tutor in all subjects, including Spanish, Latin, French, and math up to Calculus 1. If you see me on Twitter, I am a very strong advocate for self-care for women and girls of color. So I'm gonna take a moment and see some of these letters. Someone said they don't know Kendra said she doesn't know microbiology. Looks like, seeing a lot of C's here. C's and D's mostly. No, D, I said in person. D's in person. The point being that as a professional school counselor, we recognize, and often in unique ways, being a professional school counselor of color, the impact the decisions make on our communities of color and our students of color. Alicia changed her answer. Honestly, each of these leaders are only one class away of doing a significantly better job. However, I personally do not want to be a leader. And just really want to emphasize the fact that your favorite students is leading in some way, shape, or form, even if they're still in school, but definitely once they've graduated and moved on into being members of our community. So here's another question for you. This one is, what does equity work look like in your building? So A, your option is that you're already functioning and you're just here for some more tips or some support, some more information. You might be in the developmental stage. B, C, you have an informal group. Maybe you have an entanglement with a few other colleagues and haven't formally established an equity group. Or D, that you being here are the equity team in your building. So if you'll enter those answers in the chat. Seeing a lot of C's, where it seems like there might be some entanglements or some early stages of people having an interest in equity in the building. And then a lot of D's, where you appear to be the only person in the building that's interested in equity. What I'll be sharing today will be how we institutionalize anti-racism through collaborative work to address the anti-Black racism, inequity, and injustice that was occurring in the building as well as in the local community. In this presentation, I'm really going to assume the role of your critical friend. I'm thinking about it as if you were on Facebook in the Professional School Counselors of Color group and realize that I had some experience that interests you. And so I'm just a colleague that has had some experience with facilitating a building level equity group. And it's too much for me to put in a post on Facebook. We are going to begin with talking about the building profile for the building that I was working in when I did this work. We will establish working definitions of systemic change, collaboration, cultural competence, educational equity, and even discuss briefly a definition of diversity. The purpose is for us to calibrate. You'll hear me say calibrate in capacity building pretty often. Then we'll talk about the composition of the building level equity team and its goals. We'll finish off with my reflection of the work we did as a facilitator, as well as examples for you to apply as soon as today. Really, my objective for this presentation is for you to feel like you can. You'll have definitions that, working definitions that we'll address, that we'll identify so that we're calibrated, but you'll come up with some specific examples and know that at the very least, you know me and that I have done this work before. I'd like to begin with my thank yous. Thank you so much to Makisha, for founding the Professional School Counselors of Color. If you've seen me say on Facebook that this has been the source of some of the most impactful professional development I have ever had. And it's moved me as a counselor in a way that I really was not expecting a Facebook group to do. Also want to thank the admin team, Katie Brown, Carletta Hurt, our lovely host, Alicia, and of course, appreciate you coming today. Thank you for attending. I was in one of the presentations, actually viewed it on YouTube and decided that I was going to insert a trigger warning. We've experienced a lot this summer. And so I acknowledge that this is an affinity space for professional school counselors of color, while trying to ensure that I center our experiences. I would really be remiss to overlook the important consideration that school is a source of racial trauma for students and staff of color. You need to do what's best for you to take care of yourself. If you need to view the next 3 slides, the next 3 slides will be those examples, and circle back at another time. I'm holding space for you to be able to do that. You may start this presentation and feel like you are good. And then as we go along, realize that you're not. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on YouTube. So if you need to come back at a later date or reach out to me directly, you can do that as needed. So these are the 3 slides about the examples. These are also at the end of the presentation. They've been moved here specifically because of the trigger warning. Are the themes, the example themes, they are basically places where you'll be able to find inequities. Dr. John King, in a presentation that I was in earlier this summer, challenged us to examine the data of our classrooms, of the building, of the district, and look to identify the profile of a dropout, the profile of a student who has an IEP, the profile of students receiving special education services, students who are being disciplined. And if when you create those profiles, they're the same, then you have an equity issue. So these are areas where if you're looking at them, you're going to be able to find places of inequity. These are examples of activities that we did as the building equity team. I'll give you a moment to look at that. And then my experience is that K through 12 educators often need objective measures to improve their efficacy. So these are some of the items that we used to calibrate as an equity team, and also to get the larger school building on the same page as far as equitable educational practice. The school that I was working at, the climate data basically said that students felt kind of whatever about the school. However, that students of color were viewing their experience significantly worse. I'll try not to get into the problems until later on in the presentation. I do want you to note for yourself any glaring omissions. That way, if I don't cover them, by the time we get to the Q&A, we can discuss that together. Our demographics had that we had 43% students of color. However, there was another number that said that we have 36% Black students, 45% white students, 45% Hispanic students. So one of the issues that we had was the inaccuracies in the data, as well as sharing that data out so that it was well known in the building what was going on there. As you might imagine, in a building where you have a significant percentage of students that are students of color, there's a disproportionate amount of those students of color that are receiving discipline referrals. the overwhelmingly African-American students, where the African-American males was, the number of referrals was more than every other male in every other category put together. And the same thing for the African-American females. The African-American females was almost as high as all of the males in every other category as well. The building was 75% of the SPED population of the entire district. It was also 25% of the ELL population of the district. In the district plan, there were specific, the district strategic plan, there were specific items for, and that's what you'll find quite often. There were specific items about diversity and equity and inclusion. But in the building for the school improvement plan, that planning would typically occur the spring prior to an academic year. And there was over time an increasing importance of the equity team, where in the first year, when the equity team was in its infantile stages, there was a general statement in the school improvement plan about climate, as well as implementing AVID school-wide, and that was particularly to address rigor or high expectations. But the following year, it spoke specifically about the equity team and the continuation of it. About the counseling department, you know, there were 3 counselors. We had nearly 300 to 1 ratio. There was a high turnover rate for counselors in the building. There was myself, the only school counselor of color, and historically speaking, there was guidance counseling occurring in the building. Specifically, there was not a comprehensive school counseling program. So how did this even start? It really started as a book study for the book Courageous Conversations. We just kind of navigated through that. I don't even believe that we had the field manual at the time, but after the conversation, it continued, and people wanted to talk about the racial tension in the building. They wanted to talk about cross-cultural comfort with significant percentage. Most teachers in the building were white. There was one elective teacher that was Black, myself, another English teacher, language arts teacher that was biracial, and then a SPED teacher that was of Asian descent. That was virtually it. All the diversity really resided in the support staff. So that other conversations continued on after the book. And then really what happened was the team started to formulate into a team. So those my people who were saying they were kind of at sea. So we were at sea, where we brainstormed what it would look like in our building if we were equitable. And Courageous Conversations, for those who haven't read, is really focused on race. It does talk broader about equity, but it's focused on race specifically because we have found, as we're seeing even this summer, it's difficult to sustain and have effective conversations surrounding race. As a result of talking about what would it look like if we were equitable, if we were practicing equitably, specifically addressing race, 14 action items occurred. And then me being the, analyst that I am, basically kind of divide those into 3 categories. And so then the team decided that their purpose really was to connect with the humanity of students, treating all students with dignity, as well as the purpose was to eliminate the racial predictability and disproportionality for specific racial groups, occupying the highest and the lowest achieving categories. Really looking at and challenging institutionalized racism by looking at the school climate and the school culture. So I'll take a moment to discuss the definition of diversity that we were using. We wanted to really look at everything that occurred in the school, everything that happened for our students and their families from with the lens of equity. There were some ideologies and some beliefs I'll go into as far as challenges later on, but it really kind of stemmed from colorblindness and having to really explain even to the equity team that colorblindness was being willfully blind to the experience of our students in our building, not just race in general, but the students in our building, the complexities that they encountered, and how we were, as staff, being colorblind, becoming one of the largest barriers to the success of our own students. Another area that is of concern, it's always of concern when we're talking about Title I schools for me, is white savior syndrome, and having to explain that that really centers whiteness and is very othering to students of color, even in a building where they're the numerical majority. So people use the majority, minority. I don't really care for either of those phrases to use independent, let alone together, but really showing that white savior syndrome was really deficit based. That's why I'm a counselor as opposed to a different mental health professional, because I believe in positive psychology. And that as a deficit base, looking at students of color, that really upholds white supremacy. The definition for positive school environments really goes back to being student-centered and addressing the whole child. So having a positive professional relationship between the student and the staff, that's really determined by the students, not determined by that professional. That student gets to say what that relationship looks like. That students are developed and well-informed citizens that will solve our future problems as well as fulfill their dreams, dreams that they have for themselves and the dreams that their families have for them. That students are free to improve the quality of life of their family, that they love to learn, and that they are treated as human beings, and in our both, in the classroom as well as in our community and in the future. Systemic change. I think I was in a presentation yesterday or Monday where I love the definition that was the working definition that was being used. It was used for a different phrase, but it's really kind of the definition here for systemic change. And it really goes back to the idea that if it's not interrupted, it will continue. People sometimes struggle with the difference between individual racism and systemic racism. If you think about, if I take this individual person or personality out, then it's still oppressing people. It's still upholding whiteness as the standard. So it really, if you think about it, is a environment, systemic change is occurring when racists feel uncomfortable and when racist acts are rare and condemned. So it's really kind of the practices, the policies, the procedures, as well as the fidelity in which they're executed. And if it's universal, it's something that's occurring for all students. Working definition for collaboration in the third, I know this is kind of a testy subject for between the third edition of the ASCA National Model and the fourth edition of the ASCA National Model. But leadership, both leadership and advocacy used to work, be around, used to be two of the four themes for ASCA. But collaboration is really actively working with a variety of stakeholders within the school and the surrounding community. You're talking about students and families in order to impact the success of the students. So it's really answering the question, how can we provide support for students' achievement and development with this group of people? Really defining cultural competence as the ability to understand, communicate, and effectively interact with people across cultures. Cultural competency encompasses being aware of your own worldview, understanding that your perspective is one of many worldviews, and developing positive attitudes towards cultural differences as a result, gaining knowledge of different cultural practices and worldviews. And one of the most important parts of cultural competence is that it's a lifelong process. Educational equity is defined as the educational policies, practices, interactions, and resources that are representative of, constructed by, and responsive to all people, such that each individual has access to, can participate in, and progress in high quality learning experiences that empowers them towards self-determination, and reduces disparities in outcomes regardless of an individual's characteristics and cultural identities. Our equity team. So our equity team really ended up being, because it started off as the book study, a really kind of a snapshot across the building. So every department was represented. This is in high school, so every department is represented. You had administrators there, there were teachers there were support staff there. And so when all of that, so that was who was present. So it really, when I had those 14 different action items, they fell into these three categories: student development, staff development, and curriculum development. And so everything could really fall into those three areas very cleanly. There would be times where we'd have discussions and just conceptualizing, is this the student development? Is this the staff development? Is this curriculum development? But understanding that all of those interweave for the equity and creating the culture and climate of the building. Outcomes. As a result of the work that we did as an equity team, we're making attempts to close the information, opportunity, and achievement gaps for all students, but that this was an effort of the professionals being paid. It was really kind of moving a lot of people to having more of a position of hope, that they believed that what they said and did mattered, and that it had a positive impact on students then and in the future, versus, and being inert versus apathy, which is what a lot of people feel when we're talking about racism, specifically anti-Blackness racism. They feel like, what difference does it make? So as a result of these things, and you see them in front of you, we looked at a lot of the areas that were listed before, as far as topics, where places you would find inequities. So the racial makeup of the weighted classes, and a lot of it, without going too far into my critique, was not even knowing what the data was. That was a significant part of it. And then having an inaccurate perception of what things were, even when you knew what the data was, that was an issue. So greater accountability, once you know the data, taking action. Growth. Due to my background as an artist, I have a higher tolerance for critique. This shows itself in me believing in the concept of a critical friend, that if you love me, you'll tell me if my slip is showing. Really always looking to improve. So that continuous improvement part is what I'm really, really good at. Debriefing after something has happened to see how we could do better. And so a lot of the things that where we could have grown, we were having uncomfortable conversations, but really needing to explain that expecting to have conversations and always to be comfortable is a privilege. And you know, there's research about more productive conversations occurring when people are uncomfortable. But understanding, you know, for me, that some of my colleagues are used to being subject matter experts and that they were not experts in race, and that was a different position for them, and that was making them comfortable quite often. But also what I've heard in many conversations is when we're focusing on race, the usage of the word racist simply because we're talking about something that's racial, and people really struggling to not use the word racist when we're talking about race. That when we see race, it does not automatically mean that we're holding one race higher than the other. It means that we're seeing the fullness of the people involved. So managing frustration, in response to impacting the cultural competence and the educational equity that was occurring, sometimes even in the conversations that were occurring, just understanding that frustration is really evidence that you're working. The definition really that I use for frustration is that when you don't get the output for your input, and then you're frustrated. So that's typically, you need to take, we really needed to take a moment to say, we are frustrated because we're working, and just be reminded that we are doing something, and that we have a goal in mind, and that's the evidence. Frustration is an evidence of that. Also, something you're seeing probably right now, a lot of people are pushing book lists, a lot of people are pushing a lot of presentations and professional development, but really is that information that's created by people of color. I take issue with a book, a picture book with a beautiful brown face on it that was not illustrated by a person of color, that was not written by a person of color. And so are we still being really performative with some of our educational practice? Well, we really needed to use tools and learn to self-regulate both individually and collectively. A lot of emotions begin to fly, and really understanding that if we take a step back and look at something objective, this is not me saying anything about you personally, we're looking at an objective tool, and this objective tool is indicating this. But also, are we pulling objective tools again from people of color that are talking about the experience? As educators of color, as professional school counselors of color, we have the unique contribution from experience as students of color, and that is invaluable, and that having something that we really emphasize. So also, people I found would like to dominate conversations, and we would go into committees, and so we had to learn how to manage that time if we were going to come back and report to the larger group. And that was just kind of some administrative housekeeping stuff that we needed to learn. So as I've been talking, there were things that I saw as glaring omissions that as a group we were not necessarily ready to get to, that we had to build capacity to. If you were looking at this when we had the curriculum development, then that was really for me rigor. Do we have the highest expectation of all students? Are there various opportunities available to all students, as evidenced by all students being present, as evidenced by the demographics of the people who attend being reflective of the entire building? Media literacy, I think in the era of fake news, everybody needs a refresher on media literacy, but actually teaching that and understanding the value for students who are building capacity to interact as fully functional members of our society. Conversations versus action, that was kind of something we needed to really emphasize. Are we talking or are we doing? Challenging racist and white supremacist beliefs of the staff. Do you truly believe all students can learn? Or do you believe some students can learn and others are just don't culturally have that a part of their experience? Knowing the district documents, I spoke earlier about the data, knowing the data as well. With the definition of diversity, really understanding that there's intersectionality and that's an issue, and the unique experiences that result of, as a result of living in the margins of the margins for those people who are have their identities intersect. Then kind of I'm big on student voice, so shadowing students, having listening tours of families and students, doing exit surveys of our alum, as well as surveying our families, having discussions with our families. We were really weak on bringing the families in and teaching the families in the community how to advocate for themselves in the school. These are some of the topics. Again, these are the exact same 3 slides as before. And these are the actual topics that we addressed. I think one of the most impactful activities, which was very surprising to me, was looking at the racial makeup of the building compared to the racial makeup of the staff and the students, and then identifying our perception for that. These are some of the tools. I do want to emphasize that the questions for the reflective conversations really was informed by the standards, the MBCT standards, and the math and language arts, English language arts for the developmental level. Everybody in the building had a math and an English goal, and so we went to those standards for MBCT to kind of look and see what we're supposed to be reflecting on. I see a question, someone asking, when did we meet? We met every Thursday for, I believe, an hour. That is it. I am actually ready for questions.
Fantastic. All right. So looking in the chat, there's a question. What is one of the best strategies to present prison to pipeline information to educators in a way that embraces a healthy discourse from all sides of that issue?
Thank you. Very good question. This was a topic that we had to present over and over again. The school to prison pipeline, we had to actually, I think data honestly really challenges people. So if you show them the research about the school to prison pipeline, that is not just a matter of perception, that's very impactful. We actually, because of that, did a close read of the research on the school to prison pipeline, because we were teaching the skill of close read at the same time. And then we looked at our discipline data as a building. Like I said, there were audible gasps when they saw the numbers of what our discipline looked like, what it looked like disaggregated by race. And so it was just a repeated conversation so that it could be a healthy discourse? Thank you for that question.
Yeah, great. Does anyone else have any other questions before we take a short break before our next presenter? All right. Well, thank you so much, Dana. This was incredibly informative, honest. I truly appreciate your honesty about this topic and using language that we should all be using. So, yes, definitely give it up to Dana for her presentation. Thank you so much. So these are the references that
I
you
will
used
be
for your
making this
presentation.
available. I will also add in the information and the answers to the questions that were asked to the presentation and before I post it in the Facebook group.
Okay. Great. Awesome. Thank you so much. Yes, hashtag doing the work, actually doing the work, right? And not just reading about it and talking about it, but doing it in your school. I love it. Great. So we're going to take a 5-minute break while we transition to our next presentation. You enjoy, and then we'll be right back.